Thanks for tuning in to the HR Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Lucinda. The HR Uprising is focused on helping forward-thinking people professionals deliver real lasting value in their organisations. I'm a chartered psychologist, speaker and trainer, and recently authored the best-selling business book, How to Be a Change Superhero. My day job is founder and CEO of software and training business Actus. This gives me the opportunity to work with other businesses like yours. We are focused on building a better workplace for people wherever they are located, with the help of our performance, learning and talent management software and our training and consultancy services. Every week on the podcast, I will be covering different topics and challenges, joined by relevant experts and real-life people professionals. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really hope you enjoy and get value from this week's episode. Hello and welcome to this week's HR Uprising podcast. And this week we're doing something a little bit different. We're going to focus in on how we can make technical experts deliver their messaging more effectively. So I'm delighted that I've got Neil Thompson from the very fabulously named Teach the Geek with me today. And you're a former engineer, Neil, and this is now your specialism, isn't it? So you're saying you've seen lots of people delivering really important technical information, but the way in which they deliver it just doesn't land. And that's something that HR in particular could help people to improve.
Absolutely.
So how did you get into this area, Neil?
It started with my own struggles, Lucinda. I was working as an engineer in the medical device industry. I had to give presentations on a monthly basis in front of senior management. We're talking the CEO, COO, CTO, C fill in the blank O, all the C's,
Yep.
Sitting in a room, listening to project leads, which were mainly engineers, give project status updates. And my presentations were absolutely horrendous, at least at first. I mean, I didn't know it was possible to sweat that profusely from one's body while speaking, while being alive. But there I was doing exactly that. And I knew I wasn't doing a very good job because after the presentations, I would get questions that I thought I had answered during the presentation. But looking back on it now, because I wasn't the best at putting things in a way that these non-technical decision makers could understand, well, if I was sweating before and during the presentation, now I was sweating complete buckets after the presentations as well during these Q&A sessions. And you would have thought I'd got better after that, or at least known to get better after that first presentation, but I didn't. It actually wasn't until my project got canceled that I think, well, you know what? Maybe this whole presenting in front of people, this is something I should get better at. And every now and then I would sit in on other presentations to maybe get some inspiration from some of the other project leads who had to give these presentations, but they weren't all that much better at it than I was. So once that project got canceled, and I knew that was that wake-up call that I needed to get better at this whole presentation thing, I definitely went into it gung-ho. I joined Toastmasters, which for those who don't know, it's an international organization, chapters all over the world that helps people with improving their speaking skills. And now I look for opportunities to give presentations in front of others because I saw the benefit of doing so. And that basically was the catalyst for Teach the Geek. It's me getting better at giving these types of presentations and wanting to help people like myself, people in the technical fields, get better at it too.
So what is it then about a geek or a technical person? And let's face it, actually, anybody listening could probably improve their presentation skills, particularly in terms of putting messaging over to your COOs, your various C-suite people. But what is it you think that people tend to do wrong?
Technical jargon is a big issue. The words that we're used to using amongst our colleagues that we just assume other people know, specifically non-technical people know, and a lot of times they don't. But we'll continue to use these words, and especially if they're acronyms, and then they really don't know what those words mean. And we'll use those words just cavalierly in our presentations, not recognizing that we're losing people because we're using these complex words. At least they're complex to them, but maybe not as complex to us. What we really should do is use more analogies, use more simpler words to communicate with these non-technical people. It'd be a lot better for them to get the message that way. I think another issue that a lot of us have is just that lack of empathy. We weren't always the technical people that we are. at one point we weren't technical. We had to go to school, most likely, get a whole bunch of experience to become this technical expert. But yet we expect the people that we're speaking to be at the same level as us. But we weren't always at the same level that we're at now. And when we're presenting to people, we really need to think about who were we before we were that technical person? What type of information could we have understood then? And if we were to present in front of non-technical people, well, keep that person in mind. And it's become crystal clear to me on many occasions. One of which is when I was sitting in a networking event, and the person presenting was presenting marketing. I mentioned that I worked as an engineer. I didn't know a whole lot about marketing, but they were using a whole lot of words that I didn't understand. And I was looking around to see the other people in the audience, and they're all taking notes. So I'm guessing they know exactly what's going on, but here I am. I have no clue. And you would think that, well, if you're in that situation, sitting in the audience, listening to somebody, that you could very well it could be reversed, and you could be that person speaking or using a bunch of words that other people don't understand. And yet sometimes the message doesn't click right away, but it certainly did that day for me.
And I mean, and you're absolutely right. And HR are also just as guilty of having jargon and that means something to us potentially. But what's interesting is, does that mean, why don't people talk in plain English, I wonder? Is it about you don't want to patronize people by sort of explaining something that you already know? Or is it just about making sure that you're thinking about your audience? So adapting that communication to your audience?
Well, I think it's a couple of things. You use that technical jargon because you think by using that technical jargon, you're being as precise as possible, describing what you want to describe. So there's that. I think another thing is a lot of times we want it to seem smart to the people that we're speaking to. So we figure if we use these words, we'll appear that way to our audience, but all we're doing is losing them.
Yeah. I mean, do you think it is that you really feel it's about feeling smart, or is that just a comfort zone? Because actually translating, I think back to when I was in a large organization, and I always thought that you had the people who were very technical, and then you had the people who are completely non-technical, and the people in between, the ones who could translate technical requirements into strategic issues, they were few and far between. It's sort of a flexibility of style that they were able to translate technical into strategic or non-technical business language, and vice versa, business needs into technical requirements. And do you think that actually that's something that is easy to learn, or just some people have it more innately?
Well, there's certainly people that may have it more innately, but if you're somebody in that position, you probably see the benefit of being able to do that translation. If you're the technical person, you may not see it as part of your job even to do that translation. I'm not here to give presentations. I'm here to do the technical work. It's not until you get to the point where maybe you want to go for that promotion, maybe you want that pay raise, and you realize that the people who tend to get those promotions and pay raises are the ones who can communicate with typically non-technical decision makers. And then you think, well, you know what, maybe this is something I should get better at.
Absolutely. And I mean, the whole thing is the decision makers are the ones that are going to say whether you're going to do a project or they're going to fund it. So it's got to be they've got to be able to follow it and understand the benefits that you're presenting and the whys. So you talked a bit about techniques earlier, so things like storytelling and stuff and analogies. Do you have tips as to how people can do that? Not everyone finds it easy to come up with analogies.
Yeah, it's certainly not all that easy. In fact, when I first started giving presentations, I didn't even think that storytelling was appropriate for the types of presentations that I give. But I realized over time that if you really want people to follow what you're saying, storytelling is really important, and being able to couch that technical data in the form of a story can really help these non-technical people who don't have the same technical expertise as you follow along. I mean, there's been so many instances in which I've been in the audience, and in fact, this just happened yesterday, funny enough. I was at a pitch competition, and the person who ended up winning, I know exactly why they won, because they were the only person of the 7 people who gave a presentation that used story to really push the reason why we should care about their technology onto the audience and then onto the judges of the pitch competition. Everyone else was more concerned with the features of whatever their technical advancement was. And I mean, you certainly can go that route, I suppose, but you need to really get better at making people care about those features. I mean, sure, these things have these features, but what's in it for me? And that person who won, she was, and funny enough, she was the only female speaker. I don't know if that had anything to do with it, but she was the only one that used story to convey the importance of her technology. And I think that really resonated with the people in the audience.
So have you got any examples that you could use to bring it to life here in terms of this? Could you apply a story to something to help us understand?
Sure. When I worked in medical devices, I worked for a spinal implant company, and more specifically, I worked for the division that was involved with using human bone to create spinal implants. So I mentioned that I had to give these presentations in front of management on project status updates. And I could talk a lot about the work that we were doing, certainly on the project. But I think because our group was also fairly new to the organization, so very few people outside of our group even knew what we were doing. So a lot of the stories that I would talk about had to do with something like visiting the tissue bank, because that's where we get our bone from, was from accredited tissue banks. And being in the rooms where they were cutting the bone and where they were processing the human cadaver bones, and the various smells that you could get from seeing and smelling human bone being cut. It's a smell, Lucinda, that you never really forget. And it's not pleasant. And there are also stories that I would even talk about.
I didn't realize the story was going to be graphic.
100%. And bone can be very fatty as well. So there were instances in which we would need to have samples for the trade shows, and we wouldn't use the human bone because we use that for patients. We would use bone from cows. So we would go to butchers and get cow bone, and then in the lab we would do the processing ourselves to make it into our products. And man, if you've ever dealt with cow bone, trying to get rid of that fat is an ordeal in and of itself. So these are all the stories that I would tell during these types of presentations I had to give in front of management, and it certainly kept their attention.
I can imagine. I feel like I need to put a health warning at the start of this podcast episode. People first thing in the morning and listening as they walk their dogs. So that's interesting, because that's not where I thought you were going to go with story. So what you've done there is, but it's very vivid and graphic and therefore impactful in terms of that. So I was thinking it's more about, an analogy of a river, and if you were talking about cardiovascular disease or something like that, it's an analogy of a dam in a river and the banks bursting or something. So, but you're more just bringing it to life very much. And you actually started talking to me at the start of the, I mean, we've talked about bone and blood and sweat as well, so we've covered lots in just 12 minutes. But would you also get people to try and work on things like analogies? Because I think analogies are sometimes quite hard to come up with in technology. Do you have any secrets or tips for people being able to do that?
Well, when you were speaking, Lucinda, it also reminded me of another story that I used to tell, and it had to do with the cells that make up bone. Two of the cell types are called osteoblasts and osteoclasts. And I mentioned that the group that I was a part of was fairly new to the organization. So if I continue to use those terms, giving a presentation to these non-technical decision makers, osteoclast, osteoblast, this, osteoclast, that, I would probably lose them really quickly. But just knowing what those words actually mean and using the more simpler, more understandable words, that was very key in them actually understanding what I was talking about. So an osteoblast essentially is a bone forming cell, and a osteoclast is a bone resorbing cell. So basically how bone works is that the osteoblasts lay down the bone, and then the old bone is resorbed or eaten essentially by the osteoclasts. And this is just something that happens throughout life. And using those types of terms, bone eating, bone forming. Well, now, okay, I understand what those mean as opposed to osteoblast and osteoclast.
So they're much more familiar terms. You can then get your head around the benefit of whatever product you were coming up with, or what disease or otherwise. You can understand that better because you've made it plain English by translating it like that. I can see that. And so in terms of in technical or in organizations, if I'm an HR professional in an organization and actually I want to help people communicate better, get their message over better. I mean, obviously, this is one of the things that you do professionally, I imagine. But one of the things I wonder is, you said at the start, you said you'd gone and done this presentation. It's almost like you recognized yourself that it hadn't gone well enough. Did anyone ever tell you, how to present, or tell you that actually you needed to simplify it? Had you ever had any feedback in terms of that?
Funny enough, no. I mean, the wake-up call I needed, as I mentioned, was my project being canceled. Who knows? If that had never happened, well, maybe I'd be giving crappy presentations to this day, but I guess we'll never know. But it certainly was what I needed, the catalyst that I needed to get better at giving presentations. And I would hope that the people who work with me with Teach the Geek wouldn't need something as catastrophic as a project being canceled to recognize maybe this is something to get better at. Because I also mentioned earlier, the people who move up within organizations are those who are able to communicate their value to the organization, and more specifically to the decision makers. If you're the person who's technical and you think that as long as I'm technically proficient at my job, that should be enough to move me up within an organization, you'll be disgruntled. You'll be a perpetually disgruntled employee, because you'll notice that, well, this other person who I don't think even is as technically proficient as me, but they got the promotion, they got the pay raise, they got the position that I wanted. But a lot of times those people were just better at communicating why they should have those positions to these decision makers.
And also, I guess, communicating key points in a way that the decision makers understand the business case for this and they buy into. So your strategy, so I've heard you sort of say, help people understand why. Don't talk in features, talk in the why, or talk in benefits of what you're talking about. Come up with analogies, bring things to life. You've got some really vivid examples. What else would you, if you were an HR professional wanting to improve the communication of your technical people in your organization, what other things would you want them to consider?
Have a call to action at the end of your presentations, especially if you're talking to these non-technical decision makers. They want to know, what do they need to do after this presentation? Why was I even sitting here in the first place? And if you're able to communicate that effectively, I think that's a better presentation. And I'm a firm believer in coming up with what that call to action is first, and then working backwards. Yeah. Once I know what that call to action is, what kind of points do I need to make that will naturally lead to that call to action? And then once I have those points, what kind of introduction would be useful would lead to those points, which would lead to that call to action? Once you work it that way, what that does is it really helps structure the presentation well, and then you also eliminate any extraneous information that perhaps you would have added to that presentation. But if it doesn't really add anything, then you leave it out.
So that's interesting, isn't it? And that is very much sort of the Stephen Covey, begin with the end in mind, thinking, what are you going in for? Because presumably, if you're a technical expert going into a group of decision makers, you want them to agree to fund something or to include something in a strategy. There is an outcome, there's a reason, or you want them to understand something for a reason. So that's interesting, isn't it? Whereas I think quite often we start from the point of what we think we've got to help people understand. So rather than that why is to, the end point, we almost start with all the details. So it's getting the right level of detail.
Oh, 100%. I mean, I think a lot of times we want to focus on what we think is interesting about what we're talking about. But just because we think it's interesting doesn't mean that these decision makers think it's interesting. And we really need to get in their heads to figure out, well, what do they need to know? They don't need to know everything, and they probably don't want to know everything. So helping them help us is really what we need to focus on.
Absolutely. So you've got your call to action. I like that. And I guess, do you talk to people about what their slides look like, or the way in which they present stuff, the way they talk, or anything like that?
Yeah. When it comes to those slides, man, I mentioned I went to a conference not too long ago, and it's so common for technical people to just have a whole lot of text on the slide and read the slide and not look at the audience, and then go on to the next slide and do the exact same thing. And if you want people to tune out and look at their phones, that's a great way to do it. But if you want people to actually listen to what you have to say, you want to try to minimize the amount of text on the slide, because what that does is it eliminates the crutch of the presenter reading. And then it also eliminates the ability for the audience to read. Now they have to either listen or ignore you. They don't have the option of reading. So and then having images on slides, I think, is helpful too, just to keep people engaged in what you're talking about. So yeah, slides, I certainly help with that. And I've already mentioned the minimizing the technical jargon. One other thing that I've noticed, especially going to conferences, and I don't know if this is is endemic of technical people specifically, but certainly is a pet peeve of mine, is people not sticking to time. A lot, when you have a conference, you have an agenda. So if you have 15 minutes to present, don't take 16, don't take 17, because that it throws the whole agenda off kilter, and then the next person starts late, and then everything just kind of is out of whack after that. So I'm also a big fan of practicing presentations so that you finish within time. But even more so than that, say for instance, you're given 15 minutes to present. Try when you practice, finish within 13 and a half, because now in the event that you say something during the presentation that you hadn't practiced, you still have that 2 minute, 1.5 minute buffer to say those things, and then you still won't go over time.
It's being realistic, isn't it, about the amount of information that you can get over in that time frame, and less is more with those sorts of things. But therefore, exactly as you're saying, not having that sort of crutch of all of the detail. It's actually, the skill is sifting through that detail and working out what are the salient points that you need to get over. And as you're saying, being realistic about the time it takes to go through it, because actually quite often when you're rehearsing, you'll go through stuff slightly faster, unless you're very, very nervous. I know sometimes people who are nervous might speak quickly and go through it quickly, but you often go through stuff faster, or you not leave room for questions and things. So being realistic, I like that very much, sort of leave yourself a bit of slack. Don't aim to fill every single slide, right? Make that time up, and then it's so easy to run over. And people lose the will to live, don't they? At the end of the day, you've got to be realistic about how much people can absorb, particularly at a conference, because you're not the only speaker. So you might be, you don't know, you might be following someone brilliant or someone awful. Either way, that's going to have an impact on people's attention span.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, as you mentioned, there's only so much technical information people can take in, and that's even if you're speaking to a technical audience. But if you're speaking to a non-technical audience, then you really have to be mindful of that.
So very much about understanding why, understanding what our call to action is, our end point is, stories, analogies. I like the idea of visuals where they picture tells 1,000 words, but also it breaks it up if people are looking at an image, because people are then listening to you as well. In terms of that, and it maybe gets people more creative in terms of things rather than trying to read text. Any final tips, Neil, that you'd like to share with this audience?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, when it comes to giving presentations in front of others, I suspect that HR people have sat through these types of presentations from technical people, and you certainly can be part of the solution if, of course, those technical people are open to it, with helping them in knowing the best way to convey information to non-technical audiences. Realize that it's not about what you think is important. It's about what the people you're speaking to is important, keeping their needs and wants in mind as opposed to your own, and acting accordingly, as I mentioned, starting with that call to action in mind and working backwards to develop a presentation that people can actually follow.
Great. Top tips. Neil, if people want to get in touch with you to find out more about Teach the Geek or more about your tips, how would they get hold of you?
They can go to teachthegeek.com, and I also have a YouTube channel in which I offer tips on giving better technical presentations. And to get to that, they can go to youtube.teachthegeek.com.
Great stuff. So some free stuff out there that people can get to know you on a little bit. I know you're on LinkedIn, aren't you, as well?
I am.
So I'll put your LinkedIn bio in the show notes. Neil, thank you so much for joining us on the HR Uprising podcast.
Thanks for having me.
I really hope you found this week's episode useful and enjoyable. If you did, perhaps you could recommend us to a friend or colleague, or give us a review on your platform of choice. It really helps new listeners to find us. Now you can access links to any of the information mentioned in this show via the website www.hruprising.com. Further free resources are also available at www.actus.co.uk. There you can also find out more about our software and training solutions. Finally, why not join our LinkedIn group, the HR Uprising, to share ideas and collaborate with other like-minded people professionals. Thank you for listening to the HR Uprising podcast.